Good evening, ladies. This week was heavy, wasn't it? It's a hard and yet at the same time precious part of our faith to really dig in and honestly grapple with the whys. Why aren't my prayers being answered? Why does the dark valley season seem to go on for so long? And so tonight, I just wanted to share with you some things that I've been reflecting on for several months now. And I wrote an article about this not too long ago, and I'll put a link on the page to the full article later. But I wanted us to just center in on one particular element of the scriptural witness, and that is the presence of God in the darkness. Isaiah talks about finding the treasures of darkness. And that treasure in the context there in Isaiah 45 is the knowledge of God and the knowledge of his presence. And sometimes we tend to think of darkness as a place of God's absence or as the place of being separated from God. And so I want us to just look at two passages of scripture tonight, mainly Genesis chapter 1 and then a psalm, that give us perhaps a different look at darkness in relationship to the presence of God. And the first of those passages, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, is where we find the first mention of light and darkness as perhaps opposing entities in Scripture. And if we sit with that passage, there are some things that sort of leap off the page about darkness in this creation, in this foundational account in Genesis 1. And the first thing that struck me about this was the parallel between the two phrases that describe what it was like before God began to speak the creative word. Scripture describes that sort of pre-creation reality as this deep, dark, primordial chaos. It's a great word in Hebrew, the tohu vabohu. It even sounds dark and chaotic. But listen to the two phrases that describe that. Darkness was over the face of the deep. And if we just read that in isolation, it can sound like darkness might be something negative that God is going to sweep in and remove. But let's hold the two phrases in parallel. Darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Spirit of God was in the darkness in some mysterious way. The brooding presence of the Spirit, that is the signal that God is present and about to act, was in the darkness. And then the second thing that we notice in this creation account is that God separated the darkness and the light. And this is a verb that gets used 5 times in Genesis 1, each time to indicate that God is making a distinction between two contrasting things that are nevertheless related to each other. We see this in verse 4, verse 6, verse 7, verse 14, and verse 18. And all of those separated or distinguished elements are encompassed in that repeated evaluation. It was good. The darkness is not outside the goodness of creation. And then the third thing that we notice in Genesis 1 through 5, is that God names both the light and the darkness. And in Scripture, naming something infuses it with purpose, with meaning. Darkness is not banished from creation. Rather, it is set within its proper place, within the order of creation. And it's part of the divine goodness that replaces chaos with order. Darkness, as light, is part of the ordering, the goodness of creation. And so that should give us a sense that perhaps darkness is not as completely negative as we sometimes make it out to be, particularly in terms of acknowledging the presence of God with us. And then, of course, in poetry, which is where metaphor gets used, and Old Testament poetry is no exception to that, we see again this picture of darkness associated with the presence of God. If you take some time to look at Psalm 18, which is a great psalm of rescue, right in the middle of that psalm, in verses 7 through 15, there's this vibrant theophany. A theophany is when God makes his invisible self visible in some way to human beings. And this theophany, this revelation of God's presence, throbs with, pulsates with darkness. David's desperate plea for help is met with a decisive divine action. David says, God opened the heavens and came down. And then he describes this coming down of God as total darkness, or dark storm clouds beneath God's feet. Darkness as his hiding place, or the cloak with which he wraps himself. And his approach, his coming, is wrapped in darkness or dark clouds. And so this mixture of light, lightning, and brilliance mixed with darkness as part of God's self-revelation, we see it not just in this psalm, we see it in other psalms, and we also see it all over the picture of God's revelation in Mount Sinai, in the theophanies on the mountain. And so I hope that these two representative passages, Genesis 1 and Psalm 18, will offer you a foundation on which to begin to think differently about darkness, not as the absence of God, but as one of the ways in which God presents himself to us. And with Isaiah, perhaps we'll be ready and positioned to mine those treasures of darkness and to come into a deeper and more intimate knowledge of the one who is present with us in the darkness. So my prayer and my hope for you ladies is that you will find the treasures of darkness as we continue to make our way through this study of unanswered prayer. God bless you.